Darlene Franklin clutched her daughter Zara's small hand as they wove through the gleaming tile floors of North Bay International Airport. The morning light poured through floor-to-ceiling windows, turning every polished surface into a mirror. Darlene's heart thumped in her chest like the engines she would soon hear. At 62, she had learned to move with quiet confidence, but today she felt exposed. Zara's tiny beaded braids clicked softly against her shoulder with each step. They headed for gate B10, boarding pass in one hand and a toddler's backpack in the other. When they reached the jet bridge, Darlene sensed the shift in the air. Faces turned, eyes narrowed as though they could see right through her. She rubbed her palm against Zara's back, reminding herself not to read too much into it. Flight 947 to Pinewood City promised 600 miles of turbulent skies. Darlene smiled politely at the blonde attendant who stood by the door, introducing herself as Beverly. The smile never reached Beverly's cold blue eyes. "Good morning," she said softly. Beverly's lips tightened. "Seat 14A and B," she said curtly, pointing the way with a stiff arm. Darlene followed the rigid gesture, her cheeks burning. She sank Zara into the window seat, fastening the 5-point harness while stealing a glance back at Beverly. There was a flicker of distaste there that made Darlene's chest tighten. The cabin lights dimmed and the safety announcements crackled through overhead speakers. Zara waved at the attendant when she passed again and got only a mechanical nod in return. Darlene felt a dull ache at her back as she placed a coloring book on Zara's tray. The child's giggles echoed in the narrow aisle but did nothing to soften Beverly's demeanor. When beverage service began, Darlene asked for apple juice in Zara's cup. Beverly approached with a tray of drinks. She handed over the small plastic cup with a jerk, then pivoted away without meeting Darlene's grateful smile. Moments later, those same hands delivered Zara's vegetarian meal as though it were a bitter pill. The attendant paused, arching one perfect eyebrow, as if Zara's simple request had been incomprehensible. Darlene's throat tightened. Turbulence struck about 20 minutes in. The seatbelt sign blinked on. Zara's legs kicked restlessly, and the child whispered that she needed the bathroom. Darlene weighed the wobbling cabin against Zara's urgent plea and unfastened both their belts. As they crept down the aisle, Beverly blocked their path, finger jabbed at the glowing sign above. "Ma'am," she hissed, "the seatbelt sign is on." Zara's eyes grew wide. Darlene bit her tongue, guided her daughter into the cramped restroom, and prayed the attendant would let them return without incident. Stepping back into the aisle, Darlene felt Beverly's icy glare bore into her shoulders. "It was for your own safety," she said in that clipped tone. Darlene nodded, though fury flickered in her chest. Zara was oblivious now, absorbed in a puzzle on her tablet. But Darlene could not shake the injustice of it all. Kennedy Terminal had been no kinder. Pinewood City held promise, but this flight felt like a gauntlet, and Darlene knew that she and Zara would not leave it unchallenged. Darlene felt a surge of protective fury as she watched the small puddle of juice spread across Zara's tray like spilled tears. Zara's bottom lip quivered, and she stared at the sticky mess with wide, frightened eyes. Darlene grabbed a handful of napkins and dabbed at the spill, her fingers trembling. Every polite excuse she'd rehearsed evaporated in that moment. She wanted to tell Beverly off right there in the aisle, to demand an apology for the way she treated her child. But Darlene forced herself to breathe deeply, to keep her tone calm. She murmured soothing words to Zara and told her it was okay, while inside her heart pounded with righteous indignation. When the seatbelt sign finally blinked off, Darlene seized the chance to stretch both her legs and Zara's restless little body. They rose slowly, hand in hand, and began to wander up and down the aisle. The plane's interior glowed under soft LED lights, and overhead bins clicked open and closed as passengers retrieved tablets and jackets. A fellow traveler, a woman in a soft cashmere sweater, paused beside them and beamed at Zara's bright bead. "What a beautiful hairstyle," she said, crouching to Zara's level. Her warm smile was like sunlight breaking through a storm. and for a moment, Darlene felt her tension ease. But as they neared row 14 again, Darlene caught sight of Beverly whispering something to Sandra, the dark-haired attendant whose gentle presence had already been a balm. Beverly's lips formed a thin line, and her icy gaze swept toward Darlene and Zara before she turned away. That small gesture, the way she looked at them as though they were pests, Darlene felt a fresh wave of hurt. Had Zara's innocent charm somehow offended her, or was this unbridled hostility really about the color of their skin? The doubts whirled in Darlene's mind, threatening to unhinge her calm. Just then, Victor, an older gentleman from a couple of rows back, approached quietly. He perched on the edge of Zara's seat and lowered his voice. "Is everything all right over here?" His concern was genuine. He'd noticed Beverly's clipped tone earlier. Darlene managed a small smile and shook her head. "We're fine," she said softly, not wanting to cause a scene. Victor nodded, his brow furrowed in sympathy, and slipped back to his seat. Even as he walked away, Darlene felt a pang of guilt. She didn't want pity, but she couldn't shake how achingly vulnerable she felt. Back in her seat, Darlene tucked Zara in with a light blanket and opened her tablet to review the law brief for tomorrow's interview. Her fingers hovered over the screen, but her eyes kept drifting to Zara's sleeping face and then back to the harsh glare of Beverly, now prepping for the next service. The hum of the engines at 35,000 feet felt oppressive, as though the entire cabin shared her unease. A crackling announcement echoed through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're expecting another pocket of turbulence. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." Darlene's pulse spiked. She pulled Zara a little closer, pressing her cheek to the child's soft curls. The first jolt came suddenly, a fierce lurch that sent carts rattling and passengers gripping their armrests. Zara jerked awake, eyes brimming with tears. Darlene scooped her up and wrapped her arms around her child like a shield. Across the aisle, drinks sloshed in half-full cups. Beverly appeared almost instantly, striding down the aisle with measured steps. She paused at row 14, her face set, not with concern but with something colder, almost vindictive. Instead of offering reassurance, she drilled Darlene with a steely gaze, opening her mouth as if to chastise. But at that moment, the plane shuddered again, cutting her off. When the turbulence finally relented, the entire cabin exhaled a collective sigh. The pilot's calm voice came back on the intercom, apologizing for the bumps and promising smoother skies ahead. Zara's small fists relaxed, and she peered up at her mother for comfort. Darlene smoothed a hand through Zara's hair and planted a gentle kiss on her forehead, telling her everything was going to be all right. But the promise echoed hollowly in her own mind, because Beverly was still lurking. Moments later, Beverly returned with the trash bag, moving with jarring abruptness. She reached Zara's tray and without warning yanked the half-finished coloring sheet into the bag. The paper ripped and Zara let out a strangled sob. Darling nearly leapt across the aisle to snatch it back. "What is your problem?" she demanded, her voice low but fierce. Passengers turned, eyes wide. Beverly's jaw clenched, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the bag's strap. "That tray has to be stowed," she spat, "or it becomes a projectile." Her tone was contemptuous, as though Zara's tears were nothing but an inconvenience. Darlene bristled. "You could have warned us," she shot back. "You didn't have to rip it away like you hate us." The word hate hung in the air between them. Zara's sobs choked off as she looked between her mother and the attendant. Around them, whispers spread, some passengers frowning in Beverly's direction, others looking at Darlene with pity in their eyes. Darlene dropped her voice so only Beverly could hear. "We paid for these seats, just like everyone else. Show some respect." A bead of sweat glinted on Beverly's temple. Without another word, Beverly straightened, forced a tight-lipped smile, and stalked away. The corridor felt charged with tension, and the hush that followed was heavier than any roar of engines. Zara huddled into her mother's side, clutching a scrunched-up napkin as a makeshift coloring sheet. Darlene wrapped her arms around the child, murmuring apologies and promises of a new sheet as soon as they landed. The plane fell into a tentative calm, the only sound the low hum of machinery and the throbbing of Darlene's blood in her ears. 2 rows down, a kindly older woman slipped a candy bar to Zara. "Here, sweetheart," she whispered. "You deserve something nice." Zara blinked up in surprise, then accepted it with a shy smile that somehow mended Darlene's heart just a little. Across the aisle, Sandra, the dark-haired attendant, hovered, offering a packet of ginger chews when Zara complained of a queasy tummy. Her gentle eyes and soft voice were a salve. "Just a little something for the tummy," Sandra said, kneeling beside Zara. "You'll feel better soon." Darlene offered Sandra a grateful nod and managed a genuine smile. Yet even as the cabin's mood brightened, Darlene couldn't ignore Beverly's presence at the front. She had returned to reprimand a group of teenagers who were tossing an inflatable neck pillow back and forth. Beverly's voice rose sharply, nearly shouting as she admonished them to sit down and be quiet. One defiant teen shot back a sarcastic comment, and Beverly's face flushed bright red. She bristled like an animal provoked. The aisle became a battleground until the teens relented. But Beverly's temper looked ready to explode. Darlene turned back to Zara and gave her a reassuring squeeze. Her chest still ached from anger, but a fierce resolve settled in her bones. This was more than a bumpy flight. It was a fight for dignity, for her daughter's right to be treated with kindness. The rest of the journey stretched ahead, but Darlene knew she would not remain silent. Something would be done. Something that would show Beverly and anyone else who thought cruelty was acceptable that they had crossed a line, and when that moment came, it would be so spectacular, so utterly satisfying that everyone on Flight 947 would remember exactly why you never underestimate the power of a mother determined to protect her child. When the seatbelt sign finally blinked off, Darlene eased Zara to her feet and offered her hand. They rose together to stretch their legs, weaving slowly down the narrow aisle while overhead bins clicked open and passengers retrieved tablets. A woman in a cashmere sweater paused to admire Zara's colorful beads and smiled warmly. That simple kindness felt like a lifeline to Darlene, proof that decency still existed at 35,000 feet. Yet every time they neared row 14, she caught sight of Beverly whispering to Sandra and glancing in their direction with a hard, contemptuous stare. As Zara twirled a bead between her fingers, she suddenly tugged on Darlene's sleeve. "I need to go potty, Mommy." Darlene glanced up. The seatbelt sign was off, the captain's announcement long over. She started toward the restroom, but before she could step past Beverly, the attendant stormed up behind her. "Sit down right now," she hissed. "We're not allowing anyone to move about." Darlene paused, surprised. She pointed to the unlit sign. "But my daughter really needs the restroom," she said quietly. Beverly's cheeks flushed an angry red. "There is no pilot's instruction," Darlene explained, her voice firm. "Zara is just 5 years old and she needs to go." Their voices rose together, drawing looks from nearby passengers. The little girl clung to Darlene's leg, frightened by the sharp tone. Beverly accused Darlene of ignoring safety protocols. Darlene shot back that Beverly was singling them out for no good reason. The older gentleman, Victor, leaned into the aisle with concern. Sandra stepped forward, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, and said gently that as long as the sign was off, Zara could go. Beverly scowled and planted her feet, blocking the path. Zara began to tremble. Her voice shook as she whispered, "I really have to go, Mommy." In that instant, Beverly's hand shot out before any warning could be given. A sharp slapping sound cut through the cabin. Time froze. Zara stumbled backward, her cheek flaming red, her body shaking. A collective gasp rippled through the rows. Darlene's stomach dropped. She sank to her knees beside her daughter, cradling her in her arms, horror imprinting itself like an ice cube on her chest. The little girl wailed, tears streaming down her face. Darlene rocked her gently, her own voice rising as she demanded to know how Beverly dared to strike a child. Passengers sprang to their feet, voices shouting at Beverly to explain herself, to be removed. A woman 3 rows back was already dialing on her phone, though in airplane mode she could only gesture at colleagues to record the scene. Sandra, eyes wide, fumbled for a headset to contact the flight deck. Victor pushed past seats to stand at Darlene's side, his face thunderous. In seconds, Mark, the lead flight attendant, came rushing from first class. He towered over them in his crisp uniform and asked in a low, controlled voice what had happened. Passengers began accounting how Beverly had slapped Zara. Mark's face hardened. "You, step aside," he ordered, indicating Beverly with a sharp gesture. The rest of the cabin buzzed with outrage. Darlene rose, trembling but defiant, holding Zara close. "I want her restrained or removed from service," Darlene said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. "I want to speak to the pilot, to anyone who can hold her accountable." Mark nodded, his expression grave. He apologized on behalf of the airline, promised an official report, and asked if Zara needed medical attention. Darlene checked the child's cheek. It was already blossoming into a bruise, and told him she'd like a thorough check once we land. Passengers clustered, offering statements. Victor put his arm around Darlene's shoulder, voicing his willingness to testify. 2 other travelers nodded that they saw the slap. Even a flight attendant from the back emerged, confirming Beverly's earlier rudeness. The cabin felt electric with condemnation. The captain's voice crackled through, urging calm while we handled an onboard incident. As a gesture of regret, Mark offered to move Darlene and Zara into first class. Darlene hesitated, not wanting a simple upgrade to cover the harm done. But Zara was trembling, terrified, and her mother agreed. With Sandra's help, they gathered their belongings. Sandra handed Zara a blanket and a small pillow, kneeling to meet her eyes and whisper that she was safe now. Darlene managed a grateful smile through her tears. They walked to the front of the plane, each step a triumph over the injustice they'd suffered. Darlene settled into the wide, leather first-class seat, pulling Zara onto her lap. Her hands still shook, but her mind was clear. She would press charges, file a complaint, make sure this never happened again. She would not let Beverly's cruelty go unanswered. Outside, patches of golden sunlight broke through thinning clouds as the plane began its descent toward Pinewood City. Below, she could see the airport's long runway and the taxiway glistening in the afternoon light. Her cheeks were raw from crying, but her resolve felt like steel. She glanced down at Zara, who was clutching her bear, now damp with tears but still intact, whispering reassurance. When they touched down, Darlene saw the flashing lights of security and police vehicles waiting on the tarmac. Officer uniforms marched in through the forward door once the jet bridge attached. Mark guided the officers through the cabin to the first-class section. Darlene remained seated with Zara, tears drying on her cheeks, heart hammering. The captain's intercom requested everyone stay seated until authorities completed their inquiry. Uniformed officers knelt beside Darlene, asking if Zara needed an ambulance or medical exam. Darlene said she wanted a thorough check at the airport clinic, just to be safe. Then they led Beverly from the galley into the forefront, flanked by 2 officers. The flight attendant's face was ashen, guilt and fear flickering in her eyes under the harsh cabin lights. Passengers stared, their earlier anger palpable in the hush that fell. One officer took Darlene's statement, another recorded Sandra's tearful account. Victor recounted how the conflict ignited, how Beverly had blocked the aisle, how the unprovoked slap shattered Zara's world. Darlene spoke clearly, describing the pattern of hostility she believed stemmed from bias, how a mother and child should never be treated like intruders on their own flight. The officers listened, nodding, scribbling in their notebooks. Beverly stood nearby, stammering apologies, claiming it was an accident, that stress had gotten the better of her. Spite hardened Darlene's heart. There was nothing accidental about contempt in every glance Beverly had thrown at them all flight long. Nothing accidental about raising her hand in anger toward a 5-year-old. As the statements concluded, one officer told Beverly she would be escorted off the plane and likely face charges. Relief and vindication washed through Darlene. She hugged Zara, whispering, "I've got you, baby, you're safe." The officers guided them down the aisle, offering support, directing them to a waiting stretcher for a medical check. Darlene stood tall, her anger tempered now with purpose. She would see this through. Lawsuit, airline board, public statement, whatever it took to ensure no other mother and daughter suffered the same cruel treatment. Behind them, passengers watched in respectful silence. Some offered nods of solidarity, others murmured apologies. Sandra came forward with tissues for Zara, and Victor patted Darlene's hand. Even Mark gave a small, approving nod. In that moment, Darlene felt the power of community, of standing up against injustice. She took a deep breath and whispered a promise to Zara. "Mommy will make sure they never treat you that way again." And as they stepped off into the bright Pinewood City sunlight, she knew she would keep that promise with every ounce of her strength. The airline representative met them at the gate and apologized over and over, his words tumbling out like frantic waves. He offered to cover any medical bills and assured Darlene that Beverly would be suspended pending an investigation. Darlene nodded, her face calm but her chest tight with anger. She asked for the name and contact of a senior executive, making it clear she intended to pursue legal action. The rep handed over a crisp business card, his eyes apologetic but uncomfortable. Outside the arrival hall, uniformed officers guided Darlene and Zara into a quiet corner for paramedic assessment. The EMT noted a swollen bruise taking shape on Zara's tender cheek and offered an ice pack. The little girl accepted it with a timid nod, clutching its cold plastic wrap. Darlene pressed the pack gently against her daughter's skin, willing away the sting. Each time she looked at Zara's tear-glazed eyes, Darlene's resolve hardened like steel. Her sister arrived moments later, face lit with relief and horror. She wrapped Darlene and Zara in a tight embrace, whispering fierce promises that they would make Beverly and this airline pay. Darlene forced a small smile, grateful for the solidarity but determined that her own calm, measured course was the most effective. She explained that they would file charges, collect witness statements, and hold every party accountable for this blatant act of violence and prejudice. That night in a modest downtown hotel room, the mood was tense. Zara curled into her mother's side, still clutching her bear. She asked why the lady on the plane had hurt her. Darlene gently explained that some people let hate twist their hearts, but that they would not let hate define them. She promised that tomorrow they would stand up for justice. Zara sniffled but managed a small nod before drifting into uneasy sleep, her bruised cheek resting against Darlene's arm. Beverly, now suspended, sent multiple apology letters through the airline's mediation channel. Each bore increasing contrition, citing personal stress and mental health struggles. Darlene read them all but tossed them into a folder marked "Evidence." Stress was no excuse for violence against a child, and racism was no rationale for misconduct. She refused to dignify Beverly's hollow explanations with a direct reply. An official hearing date was set for 3 weeks later at the airline's headquarters. Darlene prepared meticulously, gathering witness statements, medical reports, and news clippings. She rehearsed her testimony in front of her sister and a trusted friend, sharpening her arguments. When the day arrived, she entered a glass-walled boardroom, with Zara safely in her sister's arms, surrounded by reporters and airline executives. Seated opposite Beverly and the airline's legal team, Darlene delivered her statement with measured intensity. She recounted every instance of hostility on Flight 947, the cold glares, the forced obedience, the unprovoked slap. She challenged the airline's leadership to explain why their training had failed to prevent hate-fueled violence at 36,000 feet. When Beverly attempted to apologize on camera, Darlene held up the photograph of Zara's bruise, asking if that was what Beverly considered stress. The room was silent. Then applause broke out, quiet at first, then louder, from passengers and staff who had flown in to support Darlene. The airline's CEO, present in the back, rose to his feet and offered a formal apology on behalf of the company. He announced Beverly's immediate termination, the implementation of comprehensive anti-bias and child safety training for all personnel, and a multi-million-dollar fund to support anti-discrimination initiatives in aviation. Darlene walked into the glass-walled hearing room feeling the weight of every eye in the building. Rows of airline executives, board members, and a handful of passengers sat in polished chairs, their faces a mix of curiosity and solemn concern. She settled into the witness seat, looking out across the polished table at Beverly, who sat flanked by her own legal team, eyes darting nervously. The tension in the room was as thick as humid summer air, and Darlene's heart pounded like a drumbeat, echoing through her chest. When it was her turn to speak, Darlene described every moment of hostility she'd endured on Flight 947. Beverly's tightened smile at boarding, the invasive safety check that felt like an accusation, the curt motions that treated her and Zara as unwelcome intruders, and finally, the unthinkable slap that landed on a defenseless child. As she spoke, her voice remained firm, even when tears threatened at the corners of her eyes. Each detail was a scalpel, cutting away any excuse for Beverly's behavior. Within days, criminal charges were filed for assault on a minor. Darlene met with her lawyer to discuss strategy. They drafted a civil complaint seeking compensation for Zara's therapy and punitive damages to push for systemic reforms at the airline. Darlene insisted that money alone wasn't enough. She demanded genuine, enforceable policy changes to protect travelers from discrimination and violence. News outlets picked up the story and lauded Darlene as a champion for passengers' rights. Yet she saw herself simply as a mother protecting her child. Every supportive message in her inbox buoyed her spirits, while hateful replies accusing her of overreacting were swiftly deleted. She refused to let others' ignorance distract her from the work ahead. At preschool drop-off, Zara sometimes clung to her mother's leg, wincing if anyone spoke too loudly. The teacher, a gentle woman with kind eyes, reassured her with stickers and hugs. Darlene arranged for Zara to join a music and art workshop to help her express any lingering fear. Each painted canvas and practiced melody felt like a step toward healing. Meanwhile, Darlene threw herself into her new role at the law firm, channeling her ordeal into advocacy. During lunch breaks, she drafted op-eds on racial bias in air travel. She collaborated with civil rights groups to propose model legislation requiring airlines to track complaints and enforce bias awareness training. Her colleagues admired her tenacity and quietly thanked her for helping create a safer environment for all travelers. Months later, the criminal trial opened. Darlene took the stand again, recounting the same events with calm clarity. The defense argued that it was a momentary lapse caused by turbulence and personal stress, but the prosecution highlighted the repeated microaggressions and the deliberate nature of Beverly's final blow. When the judge delivered a guilty verdict for misdemeanor assault, Darlene felt a surge of relief so powerful it brought tears to her eyes. Beverly was ordered to government-mandated anger management, probation, and a significant fine. The civil settlement followed swiftly. The airline agreed to cover Zara's therapy, donate to anti-discrimination initiatives, and overhaul its training program to include explicit bias reporting mechanisms and regular psychological assessments for crew members. Darlene negotiated fiercely to ensure the language was binding, not just empty corporate rhetoric. That afternoon, Darlene reflected on the journey they had taken, from a single slap in a cramped cabin to policy reforms that would protect countless families. She had turned a moment of cruelty into a catalyst for change. She had stood up for her daughter and, in doing so, had reshaped an industry's approach to dignity and respect. When Zara first asked, "Mommy, why did we worry so much about ladies in uniforms?" Darlene's heart swelled with both pride and sorrow. She knelt beside her daughter on the soft carpet of their living room and gently tucked a stray curl behind Zara's ear. "Because, sweetheart," she said, looking into those big brown eyes, "we want to make sure everyone is kind, no matter what they wear." That simple exchange spoke volume. It showed how even the smallest voice can insist on respect, even when the world seems determined to deny it. As the years passed, that day on Flight 947 never lost its sting. Every time Darlene saw a flight attendant glide down an aisle, her pulse quickened. Every time Zara put on her little backpack before preschool, she paused, smoothing the fabric of memories. The bruise on Zara's cheek had faded long ago, but the lesson it left was permanent. Whenever someone asked why Darlene spoke so insistently about bias and air travel, she would say, "Because my daughter deserves to board any plane and feel safe from hurtful hands." In the months after the hearing, word spread through travel industry circles about the slap heard round the cabin. Airline executives who had once dismissed complaints now found themselves poring over training manuals. Senior managers attended workshops led by Darlene's civil rights colleagues. New policies were drafted in boardrooms that once tolerated only profit margins. It was a slow burn, but it was real change. The airline where Beverly had worked established mandatory bias awareness sessions for every member of the crew, from gate agents to pilots. Other carriers followed suit. On one bright spring morning, Darlene stood at a national symposium on customer rights in Chicago. Hundreds of delegates filled the grand ballroom. She spoke in a clear, confident voice about the urgent need for transparent complaint processes and psychological screening for safety personnel. When she showed a photo of Zara standing in her kindergarten uniform, smiling beneath the scar of that long-ago bruise, the room fell silent. Then applause washed over her like a wave. That moment was sweeter than any legal victory. Yet even as the mother and daughter celebrated, Darlene never forgot the cruelty of Beverly's glare, the contempt that preceded the slap. In her quiet moments, she would revisit every detail: the stiff point of the arm, the curt refusal to help, the shame in a crew member's eyes when the cabin erupted in protest. That memory, as painful as it was, became fuel for her advocacy. It reminded her that progress demands vigilance, that prejudice can wear a uniform as easily as a disguise. Over time, Darlene helped draft legislation nicknamed the Zara Protection Act. It required airlines to publish quarterly reports on passenger complaints, mandatory third-party reviews of plausible bias incidents, and regular mental health evaluations for staff in sensitive roles. The bill passed with overwhelming bipartisan support, a testament to the power of one mother's determination. When president and congressional leaders signed the act into law in the East Room, Darlene watched from the gallery, hand on Zara's shoulder. The child's eyes sparkled as she whispered, "We did it, Mommy." Life, of course, is never without new challenges. There were days when media outlets chased their story again, dredging up old trauma. There were times when Zara hesitated before boarding a bus or a train, questioning whether the world had truly changed. But each time, Darlene would take her hand, remind her of every victory won and every promise made. "You are safe," she would say. "Your mother made sure of it." By the time Zara entered middle school, she was a confident, empathetic young person. She volunteered at community centers, organized bake sales to raise funds for anti-discrimination nonprofits, and wrote essays on kindness that earned her awards. Teachers praised her leadership and fierce sense of justice. Darlene looked on with the same pride she had felt standing on that windy tarmac. Only now the pride was deeper, tempered by years of witnessing her daughter's resilience firsthand. Each year on April 24th, the date of the infamous Flight 947 incident, mother and daughter visited the mural in Terminal 2. They placed fresh flowers in a vase built into the wall and said a quiet thank you to the strangers who had stepped forward to help them. It was a ritual of remembrance and renewal, a promise that they would carry that experience forward as a call to compassion rather than a burden of bitterness. Now, whenever Darlene hears a child giggle in the boarding area or sees two strangers sharing a seat without a second glance, she feels a surge of hope. The aviation industry still has miles to go. Racism and cruelty can take flight anywhere at any time. But she knows that the spark of one mother's outrage, focused into determined action, can light a blaze of reform. And that fire keeps her, and now Zara, moving forward with confidence. So whenever you board your next flight, Remember Darlene Franklin and her daughter Zara. Remember the day a simple request for a restroom trip turned into an act of violence, and how that act birthed an unstoppable demand for justice. Because every time you choose kindness over contempt, respect over disregard, you echo the power of one brave soul who refused to let a slap define her life. And in that choice lies the sweetest revenge of all, watching prejudice fall away under the unyielding force of love, solidarity, and the unbreakable bond between a mother and her child.